Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Citi UK Annual Conference. Welcome to this particular conversation, which is about financial services and growth in financial services and related industries. My name's Anna Edwards. I'm a presenter at Bloomberg TV, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this conversation for you this morning. We have some fantastic panelists waiting in the wings to join us, but I'll just tell you a little bit about what we're going to discuss. We hope to examine the ways in which the financial services and related professional services industry can evolve in order to meet the challenges of the future, sitting as we do in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, still fighting it, of course, in many places, and as the UK charts its course after exiting the European Union. So a great time to have this conversation about the future growth prospects for UK financial services and related industries. I'll introduce then our panelists and we'll get straight into our conversation. I'm joined in alphabetical order by Katharine Braddick. Katharine is Director General for Financial Services at the Treasury, leading on all aspects of policy for financial services, and is the Treasury's member of the Financial Stability Board. I'm also joined by Andy Briggs, MBE. Andy was appointed CEO of Phoenix Group in March 2020. He was previously Group Chief Executive of Friends Life, the listed insurer, Managing Director of Scottish Widows, Chief Executive of the Retirement Income Division at Prudential, and Chairman of the ABI. We also have with us the Right Honourable the Lord Hill of Oareford CBE. Lord Hill, Jonathan Hill, is a former UK government minister and European commissioner. He was a commissioner between July 2014 and 2016, Britain's European commissioner with responsibility for financial stability, financial services and capital markets union. Most recently, of course, he chaired the Chancellor's UK listings review, something that no doubt will come up in this conversation, and we will explore a little with him. We're also joined by Heath Tarbert, who I'm pleased to say is joining from Chicago, so gets extra special points for getting with us so early. 4 a.m. I think it is Heath's time. Heath is Chief Legal Officer at Citadel Securities, responsible for the firm's global legal compliance, surveillance and regulatory affairs function. Prior to joining Citadel Securities, Heath was chairman and chief executive of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, and he previously was assistant secretary of the Treasury for international markets in the US. So a great panel, a great lineup. We also would like, though, to request some audience participation so that everybody is fully engaged with this conversation. And to assist us in that, we've got a couple of poll questions that we would like to put to the audience. These two questions will come whilst we're busy having our conversations. But if you're watching this and you see these poll questions pop up on the website that you're watching this on, please do answer them. We hope to use the results as we go through the panel to sort of inform our conversation, if you like, and weave those into what we are discussing. I should also point out that there is an opportunity to ask questions of the panel. So get your thinking caps on and put those questions to the panel. You can do that using the chat function on the platform. So please use the chat function to put questions to the panel, and we'll get to the Q&A section with the panel a little bit later on. So let's kick things off. And I'll kick things off by tapping into the specific area of expertise of each of our panelists with one particular question for them. So Lord Hill, if I could come to you first, welcome to the event. If we could start with the listings review publication that you very recently worked on. Further to the publication of your listings review recommendations, which initiatives do you believe that the government should prioritise in order to strengthen the UK's position as a leading global financial centre?
Well, thanks very much, and it's good to join you. Oddly enough, I think the recommendation in there that's got the most potential, if it's followed through both by the government and by the market, is the recommendation that we made for the Chancellor to make an annual report to Parliament about the state of the city. And the reason I think that has potential is that it provides a framework, some scaffolding for all parts of the market, government and regulators, to work together to try and make sure that we keep the environment competitive over time. I think if you look at where we've been after the last 5 years since Brexit, I think there's been a period of stasis and paralysis. I think regulation, naturally can tend to be quite static. And I think the most enduring benefit we might be able to get from that listing review is to create something that is more dynamic and where the regulators, government and the market work together over time at making sure we've got the most attractive, globally competitive environment that we can have.
Okay, Lord Hill, thank you for those opening remarks. We'll come back and explore some of those shortly. And picking up on that, continuing with something related, Katharine, Braddick, if I come to you next, in what ways can the UK's regulatory framework be more agile? We just heard Lord Hill talking there about dynamic regulation. So in what ways can the framework be more agile in order to create an environment which enables the industry to continue to support businesses, create jobs, innovate and drive growth?
Thanks, Anna, and thanks for inviting me here this morning. Thank you to TC UK. Regulation in a sector like financial services is intimately connected with its success, with its competitiveness and the way it serves the economy. If we want financial services to serve our economy, they need to be generating investment and creating jobs, and they need to be profitable. We are therefore, as well as Lord Hill's really incredibly helpful work on listings, we're therefore also looking at funds, how to create an environment for long-term funds to locate in the UK. We're looking at our regime for asset management more generally, and we're looking at how to make regulation more effective, in particular for wholesale markets and for insurers, because we need safety and resilience and transparency, and we need that in the most efficient way we can to free up capital and investment into our economy and to encourage innovation to locate in the UK and generate jobs. So we also saw at the budget an announcement around visa reform so that we can attract talent. We need regulation to keep pace with a maturing tech market. We made an excellent start here in the UK, I think, a decade ago, and our regulatory sandbox became a model that was copied all over the world. But we now need that model to address the fact that those firms are achieving scale. So the FCA is setting up a regulatory scale box, and they're also going to launch in the autumn a regulatory nursery for newly authorised firms coming out of the sandbox. So that's really about a maturing sector and continuing to ensure that regulation is sized and supportive of its growth and addresses the risks effectively. And we need to be at the forefront of understanding the risks and opportunities of tech, which is why we've just consulted on the next step in regulating crypto assets, and we in the Bank of England are working closely on central bank digital currency. And finally, we need regulation that creates the market practices and norms for a financial services sector that supports the shift to a net zero economy here and all over the world. There's an important part of that story which is working about international partners, because we need international markets with sound pricing of assets for those goals to be achieved. The G7 communique the weekend before last that committed to disclosures was really important in that respect, and we'll be building out what's called the green curve with our own issuance of a green gilt in the course of this year. These factors, innovation and technology, green and climate, and regulation and reform, are obviously mutually reinforcing, because you have a sector that attracts and fosters financial services business that support the transition to net zero and harness technology that is bound to serve our economy, and that's the goal we're trying to achieve.
Okay, so a host of factors in the mix there. We'll return to all of those with Katharine and with the broader panel. Andy, let me come to you. Andy Briggs, what role can the pensions and the insurance industry then play in growing the UK economy as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you, Anna, and add my thanks to City UK and the sponsors for putting this event on. It's great to have this opportunity to talk with the other speakers, and I agree with all that has been said so far. I mean, I think the pensions and insurance sector can play a massive role here, because we are investing £1.7 trillion on behalf of our customers, and we can really work to invest that money to help Britain build back better and greener. We already have a core fundamental role and purpose in society. In the UK, we've got an ageing population. In any developed nation, that means there's reducing state support. And we then have, as well in the UK, a shift away from defined benefits and pension freedoms. And so there's a huge kind of social need for the pensions industry to help people on that journey to and through retirement, to help them achieve what they're trying to in later life. At Phoenix Group, for example, we're investing £338 million on behalf of our customers. So we can do that both to help the levelling up agenda, to invest in infrastructure, but also to help the green agenda. And that's a central part of our purpose. a customer can join us in one of our workplace pension schemes as a 25-year-old. They could still be a customer of ours in 50 or 60 years' time. They want us to invest their money, their share of that £338 billion, in a way that means the planet is one they want to live on and they want their children and grandchildren to live on in 50 or 60 years' time. So a real huge opportunity for the insurance sector to make a big difference here. Not only is it the right thing for us to do in terms of our role in society, but also it makes complete sense commercially. If we embrace sustainability and put that in the centre of our business model, we will attract better talent, we will attract and retain more customers, we will attract more investment over time. And that's why at Phoenix we've committed that our own operations will be net zero carbon by 2025, that our investments will be net zero carbon by 2050. And we made those commitments back in December. We were the first large insurer to make those commitments at that time. So I think a fundamental role we can play.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your thoughts, Andy, so far. We'll be back to you shortly. Let's then bring in Heath Tarbert into the conversation. And we heard Katharine there referencing the importance of international coordination, Heath. So lest we become too focused on our own backyard, let's take things transatlantic a little bit with you. How do you believe then that the UK-US regulatory relations can be strengthened, particularly in this post-Brexit context?
Thank you so much for having me, Anna, and it's great to be here at Citi UK. I think when I think about Brexit, obviously it implies a distancing from the city in the UK from Europe, but it's also a tremendous opportunity because for years, 30 years or so, if the United States wanted to interface with the UK on financial regulatory issues, it could do so bilaterally, but to a large extent, we were constrained because ultimately those rules, the equivalence decisions and everything else were largely set in Brussels. The fact that we now have Brexit means that the United States and the UK can potentially partner together in ways that we haven't in the last 30 years or so. I want to thank my former sort of counterpart, Katharine Braddick, at the HM Treasury for working with me to set up the US-UK Financial Regulatory Working Group, where we started a few years ago exploring those issues with Brexit. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, I think, to combine the large capital markets that the United States has with those right there in the City of London, to streamline things, to figure out ways in which we can work together. I think in particular, financial innovation is one of those things that the UK has traditionally always been a leader in, as have we in the United States. And that's an area where I definitely see potential growth.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Heath, for your opening remarks. So a lot to think about there. Hard to know where to start in this conversation. Plenty of topics in the mix. Let me go to something that we heard first from Lord Hill, and that was about dynamic regulation. I wonder if you could just expand on that point a little bit, and we'll get Katharine, Andy and Heath's thoughts on this. How do you make sure that dynamic regulation is sort of tough enough and up to the challenge whilst also remaining dynamic and being flexible enough? This might very much depend on the example or the specific regulation you're talking about, Jonathan, but I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on what we've learned about that over years.
Yeah, it's a broad point about regulation. Most regulation comes about in response to a crisis, and you've got rear mirror regulation. And then, I mean, if I take Europe as an example, where I used to do a regulatory job, the process of putting that regulation in place is such a complete nightmare. And it's such a series of compromises and internal contradictions that once you've done it, you never want to look at it again because the politics don't allow for it. Meanwhile, we're undergoing huge technological disruption in all markets, but financial markets are a good example of that. So I think that the question as to how you can construct a regulatory system, both politically and from the regulator's point of view, that is able to move more quickly, think globally. I mean, I'd echo some of those points that Heath made about the opportunities that now exist, I think is where one wants to concentrate. So should the UK, as a unitary state, be able both to make sure that the existing body of regulation can be adapted and flexed as necessary. But even more, the areas which we have not yet regulated, in the areas of fintech, emerging green finance, that we don't know what shape they're going to take. But the opportunity there, I think, for the UK working with global partners, we have to think about our place globally rather than in the context of the EU solely, I think is what creates opportunities. I think the only other thing that people would talk a lot about is the nature of regulation, this feeling that we've become quite rules-based, prescriptive, using lazy shorthand, the kind of European approach of a more compliant, heavy, detailed, prescriptive approach to regulation. Can we move to a more principles-based, outcomes-based set of regulation? I think there is a whole area of opportunity and of interest.
Okay, so Katharine, do we have more flexibility then to forge the type of regulation that works for the city post-Brexit, given though that we still need to be mindful of international coordination, as Lord Hill was just mentioning and you referenced earlier?
Yeah, and I think so. So yes, we do have now complete control of our rule book, and that gives us control over how we set the standards and what the standards are, and how we connect a coherent sort of strategy about what they're supposed to be achieving. I think it's important to say, firstly, that high quality regulation is particularly important to the UK because financial services is a very large part of our economy, and we have a very international financial centre, so very exposed to vulnerabilities in the global system. And we're very exposed to instability in the sector. And that's why the UK taxpayer still owns such a large chunk of NatWest. And as the financial crisis recedes in the rearview mirror, it's important that we don't forget the importance of that. The reason that the COVID crisis didn't turn into a financial system crisis in the course of last year was we have a much stronger system than we did. What we do have now is the ability to tailor standards more closely to our own requirements. That needs to be within an international rules-based system because it has to be converged around international norms, or we're exposed to risk elsewhere, or we're exposed competitively. And I think it's important to be clear that although I mentioned wholesale markets reform, I mentioned Solvency II reform, there are ways in which we can make this regulation work better than us. But the UK was very closely involved in the establishment of European standards. We worked really hard and we had quite a lot of influence on how they're shaped. So any idea that there's some vast philosophical gap about risk appetite or financial regulation, I think is really misplaced. And I think what we need to do is find a path where we can have reference to and fully understand our European partners and also our US partners. As Heath said, he and I put a lot of work into that relationship, I think really productively in recent years around regulation. And also that we remember that international firms in particular don't want a different regulatory regime in each major jurisdiction they're operating in. Our regime could be absolutely optimal, but if it's radically different from the EU and the US, that imposes cost that is still just cost. So we have quite the careful path we need to tread here, where we need to cleave to the importance of international convergence and high regulatory standards. And that's the way we will find our way through this, I think.
Right. So, Katharine, we shouldn't expect then a sort of wholesale ripping up of rule books. That would be to overstate what's going to happen here. But are there areas in which you would anticipate big change, knowing the shape of the UK financial services versus Europe, knowing what maybe took us in a direction we didn't want to go in when we had to coordinate more fully with our European partners?
Yeah, so I think you can see, I think we've been quite transparent about where we're looking to make change because we think it's material as opposed to just sort of fiddling about for optimization purposes. Solvency II, our problems with the risk margin and the matching adjustment are of long standing and well known. So I don't think anybody would have been surprised that we said we were going to have a look at that, and we did a call for evidence on that at the end of last year, and we'll be consulting later this year on changes to Solvency II. And on wholesale markets, of course, in the single market, the great preponderance of capital markets activity was in London. So what is in Europe described as MiFID and MiFIR bore heavily upon the UK. Now that we have that market. We just need to make it work. We need to make the regulation work just for one and not for 28. We can definitely look at things that didn't work for us there, and we'll be consulting later in the summer on those changes. I think the point is that we need to. There is no point in diverging for the sake of it, for the purpose of ideology. We diverge because there's a material enough economic benefit, and it's important to remember that regulatory soundness is an economic end in itself as much as proportionate regulation is.
Okay, and with Solvency II in the insurance sector in mind, then let's go to Andy Briggs and your call. The Treasury is listening, and our audience is listening. Andy, what is it that you want to see in terms of regulatory change that allows your industry to tap into the things you talked about before, the growth opportunities that you mentioned?
Yes, so I completely agree with Katharine that much of the regulation we have is very fit for purpose. We want a strong regulatory regime. We need to maintain consistency where appropriate with international standards. But I also agree with Jonathan's point that when you've got 28 countries trying to agree something, there'll be areas where there's a genuine reason for divergence. And I'll draw two examples of that out. One would be around Solvency II, where basically the UK annuity product is pretty unique globally in that it's a product the customer buys and then cannot sort of surrender again. And so the Solvency II regulation is trying to get 28 state regulation around treatment of a product line that only really exists in the UK. So basically, the main focus there, as Katharine's just said, is on the matching adjustment. And it's evolving the rules there so that we could invest far more into the sort of a liquid asset investment that we like to do that will support both infrastructure development and sustainable development and green development. And we already do a fair bit of that. At Phoenix, we've said we would commit £20 billion over the next 5 years from our annuity funds into that type of investment. So very material amounts. That's probably about 100 billion across the insurance industry as a whole. That would be one area. But the other area that Katharine also mentioned was MiFID II regulation. And this is a great example for me of exactly the point we're talking about, because in the UK, uniquely, we have something called the Retail Distribution Review. Basically means that advice to consumers around investments and pensions must be done on a fee basis, which is entirely fair and appropriate. But if you then combine that with MiFID II regulation, which basically says that you can give a very basic level of education and information before you cross a line, and then you must go to full fat advice. Now, what happens in continental Europe is you still have commission-based advice systems. So lots of the population in continental Europe still get advice. In the UK, only while people have these really fundamental decisions to make on their journey to and through retirement, only 8% of the population are getting advice because people don't want to pay fees for full fat advice. And so that's another great example where there's something specifically different about the UK market and how it works. Regulatory change will be really beneficial to consumers. 92% of consumers are making their decisions on retirement income without any help and support. It will lead to poorer outcomes as a result.
Okay. And Heath, just so that we don't lose track of the regulatory winds that might be blowing across the Atlantic, I wonder if you could just give us your insight into the direction of travel stateside. As you described a situation where there might be further opportunities for US-UK cooperation post-Brexit. So good for us to be mindful of the trends, the winds that are blowing through the sort of corridors of power in Washington.
Yeah, so we obviously have new regulators in place here in the United States. I think they are very eager to sync up with the UK in particular on a number of fronts, ESG being one of them, which is something that I don't think we've seen, at least in the recent past. So I think there are real opportunities here for areas of agreement. I would just quickly, Anna, put on my Citadel Securities hat to touch on some of the points that were raised earlier. We do business all around the world in dozens of markets. And it's really important to stress that it's high quality regulation that we seek. Low quality regulation jurisdictions are actually a danger for us. And so I think there's going to be a real temptation here post-Brexit for the UK to potentially become more opaque, to sort of not have the kind of standards in terms of transparency, competitiveness, resiliency. I think there's a lot of probably room to cut some red tape that has come with European Union regulations. But I actually think in the long run, the UK, in having high standards and indeed even doubling down on things like transparency, will ultimately be beneficial for the US economy. It'll be beneficial for the markets that we make markets in at Citadel Securities, for the kinds of firms that Andy, for example, is familiar with, pension funds, insurance funds. So I would just say that the UK is not in a position where it needs to lessen its rules and regulations. I think Lord Hill and Katharine got it exactly right, that high quality regulation in the long run will make Britain even more competitive, because you have so many other things going for you: a stable economy, a system of rule of law, London, time zone, an educated workforce, and everything else.
Okay, yes, Heath, at 4:30 in the morning. Yes, I'm sure you'd be better off here in London this week. But post-COVID, we can make that happen. Let me get the insight of our audience, shall we, at this point, because regulatory framework comes up in this conversation, or this poll question that we just asked the audience. So if we can just go to the results of the first poll question, it was the two most important competitive differentiators that will be key to the future success of the UK's financial services industry are, drum roll, and hopefully we'll be able to see the results as well. So, I mean, it's a difficult job to try and choose out of all of these. And I'm not sure if everybody is able to see this, but I'm going to give you a rundown. We see that many people have gone for the importance of talent depth and diversity. We've also seen people talk about a culture of innovation. So I think this taps into a couple of things, Katharine, you were talking about the need to be able to recruit the right talent, and also making sure that we can innovate. There's also support for the idea of we need this sound legal and regulatory framework. We were just discussing that. Integrity of conduct is in there. Cross-border openness gets quite a few votes. Transparency, less at the top of the agenda today. But let's go to the top of that then. So some of the highest support, I suppose, from our audience: cross-border openness, culture of innovation, talent depth and diversity. Let's linger on the culture of innovation then, Katharine. I mean, what do you think it is about, or what is it you're trying to drive in terms of innovation? You mentioned fintech, and this is clearly a place that a lot of the innovation is happening, not exclusively, but where is it that you're really trying to drive this innovation in the city?
So there are some quite sort of straightforward mechanical things we need to do, which is, understanding how tech is changing the provision of financial services, which it is radically. And we've seen that certainly very significantly in payments, but now increasingly elsewhere. We need to understand that. We need to create a regulatory environment that makes it safe, but makes it capable of being offered in a way that harnesses those benefits for businesses and for consumers. And we now have, quite a long history in doing that here in the UK. And it's extending, I think, as Andy was indicating, out into the advice market from the world of payments. There's something more subtle and intangible, which is about having an ecosystem. You foster a kind of community of people who understand tech and a community of people who want to invest in tech. And that's where Ron Khalifa's review was really important. We're delivering his recommendations there, which I mentioned some of, and he also suggested a kind of institute for us to help think about these issues. But it also connects closely with the work that Lord Hill did that was so important about listings, because that's also about attracting tech into the UK, not just attracting businesses to list, but to attract investors who understand tech. And what you want is a kind of positive relationship between those two sides of the equation, fed by the ability to attract talent. So to grow our own talent, but to attract talent from overseas. And this is not chemistry. This is an art. This is about bringing all these things together and hoping that and intending that they work together to create that environment, which I think, as I say, we have been successful in doing, but it is a constant competition and it's a constant demand, and we need to keep pace with and ahead of where the market is and what it's thinking, to make sure that we continue to compete, we continue to have that ecosystem.
Lord Hill, let me come to you, because Katharine, they're mentioning your report, and part of that was trying to tap into the more recent trend we'd seen towards SPAC listings, special purpose acquisition companies, and the ability to use those in London, and whether we were maybe falling behind other jurisdictions in our ability to use those. How do you see your report has gone down? Clearly, it was about more than that, and you pointed to the need for other things to come out of the report, like an annual report by the Chancellor to Parliament on the state of the city. So that's the broader point. But in terms of the SPACs specifically, what did you make of the reception that your report got on that front?
Well, I think that we, as you say, we made a range of proposals to try to make sure, really, we just looked at it through the simple prism of how do we make sure that London is broadly consistent with high standards, broadly competitive with other global financial centres. And so then whether we were looking at questions of free float or dual car shares or SPACs, I mean, the prism we looked through was, can one think about it, making sure that we are, as I say, broadly consistent with what companies could find in other jurisdictions. So there was nothing in the report, going back to a point Heath was making and Katharine alluded to, about kind of opening up a gap with other jurisdictions by undercutting them. If I'm honest, it was about closing a gap which has opened up in recent years. And so I think in terms of the response, Anna, I mean, I think there's been, which I think is an important point, of a very positive response from the regulator, from the FCA. You might have thought that the regulator might feel a bit standoffish. Who's this bloke poking around in stuff that they're responsible for, the listing rules, but they weren't at all. And I think that does speak to a more open attitude and this sense of opportunity that I see both among politicians and regulators, now that we've left the EU and things, have got some clarity, to think about things anew. So there was a very positive response from the FCA, and they have cracked on extremely fast in taking forward the recommendations that were for them. They have, as you know, already announced a consultation on SPACs. They're due to bring forward shortly consultations on the other issues. Katharine and her team in the Treasury have also been moving fast to take forward the recommendations that were meant for them. And I think more generally in the marketplace, I mean, clearly you get a range of views depending on how one approaches it. But I would say that the overall response in the marketplace was people were keen, firstly to get behind these recommendations, but also I think because they spoke to a broader truth that we just need to keep working at making sure we're competitive. And so I think they very much welcome what the Treasury are doing in working through, bit by bit, a series of initiatives looking in a sensible way at opportunities for reform.
Is there a sense that, is this an area where working with the US would be useful to, you say you wanted to close the gap perhaps, or it was about setting out the opportunity for the UK to close the gap in terms of its offering on different types of listings. But there are some in the United States who seem to be a little unsure about the role of SPACs and just how popular they've become. Is there a sense that regulators could learn from each other cross-Atlantic, Lord Hill? Maybe Heath has thoughts on that in just a moment.
Yeah, I'm sure Heath will. I mean, so definitely. And I think this theme that Katharine and Heath have alluded to, that you if you want to be a global financial centre, you have to seek to establish high global financial standards, and how one can learn from each other. I mean, Katharine, and Heath will know more about this on the ground than I will. But all regulators work together to learn from each other. And I'm sure that we will. Your example of SPACs, it's clearly developing, moving quite fast, that whole space. Where it's going to land, no one yet knows. Does it make sense for the UK to learn from how the US regulators are thinking about it, whatever changes they might think about putting in place? Yeah, of course it does. And I think equally there'll be lessons, the other way, that the US can learn from the UK working in global fora.
Heath, jump in. Your thoughts stateside on the SPAC phenomenon.
Well, I couldn't agree more with Lord hill, which is essentially all of us that have been either our regulators or former regulators. We're always trying to find that sort of golden Aristotelian mean between innovation on one side and sort of proper risk reduction regulation on the other. I think on the SPAC side, we were more innovative here in the United States, but now you see us in the United States saying, well, maybe we should put some guardrails around this. So we're sort of moving in that direction. You take fintech, I think the UK was much more sort of pro-innovation than the US has been in setting up the sandbox, which, as Katharine said, really has been an example. So we are looking to the UK to think about, well, maybe on crypto and other areas, we're behind over here in the United States. So it's important to have that dialogue and to learn from each other. But I think at some point, as with everything, like the Basel rules in the 1980s, at some point there's sort of a consensus and a convergence, and then we move on to another area of innovation.
Okay, and Andy, let me pivot slightly and get to something else. And just to say, if anyone does want to ask any questions to our panel, now's a good time to get those in, and I'll sort of work them into the conversation. But some people interested in the green theme, and Andy, let me come to you on that, because we're talking about where regulation, where coordination can help, and maybe in defining what on earth is a green investment. That would be a good place to start. We've seen the EU put forward its taxonomy, and I know that work is very much underway in the UK to do something similar. Andy, is this a sort of missing key part of the ingredients? As now the direction of travel on this seems to be much clearer as increasing numbers of businesses and regulators align behind net zero. It's just exactly defining how we get there. Still a bit of a challenge.
I think more and more businesses are aligning behind, and frankly, those that don't will struggle. They won't get the best talent, they won't attract and retain customers, they won't attract investment. So, and I think the engagement we have with government and regulators is fantastic on this. So we start from a good place, but there is a lot to be done to make it happen in practice. And let me give a specific practical example. It's probably going to cost in the UK about £250 billion to make the UK housing stock suitable for renewable energy, green energy. And this is a classic area where it's a very long-term, a liquid investment that would ideally suit the insurance sector to make the investment. But for an individual insurer to try and do that unilaterally, to go to a group of people and say, we'll lend you the money to make your home green if you pay us a regular amount back on it going forward, it would make far more sense to think about that in a coordinated way, with government, with regulation, with insurers, and then with supply chains as well. And while we're at it, one of the biggest challenges we also have alongside the move to net zero is social care. And I think post the pandemic, with an ageing population, far more people will need long-term care. At the moment, only 0.5% of the UK housing stock is suitable for assisted living. So there'll be a real opportunity as you go through this kind of transformation of the housing stock from a renewable energy perspective to also make far more of it suitable for assisted living. At the same time, you can probably do the two things for not much more than the cost of one. And more people would prefer to stay in their own homes longer term as well. So there's I think that there's great engagement around all of this, but I think we need more to get the whole picture to work as a whole, and that's what we're all working towards.
Andy, that's really interesting. Katharine, can I just come back to you? Can I come to you then on that, and what it is that the Treasury is looking at to try and help all of this, these pots of money that are seeking green investments, for example, the greening of the UK housing stock? How does that money find that opportunity? And then I have a question for you on the EU Memorandum of Understanding, but we'll start with this one, just picking up on what Andy was saying.
Yeah, and what Andy describes there is what we hear from industry leaders like him, which is there is a massive demand for this investment, and what needs to be in place are the market norms that enable the effective pricing of assets, so that and the operation of market practices, so that it's predictable, so that investment can be effectively allocated. And it's important to be clear that that is not just a domestic challenge. There is no jurisdiction that can fund the transition to net zero purely domestically. We have to foster internationally sort of mobile, deep, liquid pools of capital for effective allocation. So in the UK, we were the first developed economy to announce making TCFD, that's climate disclosures, mandatory across the economy, and we'll have got most of the way there by 2023 and fully there by 2025. We've said that building on the EU's approach on taxonomy, which is very developed, we're going to take a taxonomy approach in the UK, and we're just putting together our expert panels there. But at least as importantly, we are pushing forward in international fora, including the places where Heath and I used to meet and talk about these and other issues, to really continue to push for international convergence around, you know, a sort of core level of harmonization, so these markets can work internationally, so that capital can be allocated effectively, and so that demand Andy just described, which is so powerful and expressed so clearly by people like him to us day in, day out, can actually be met. It's really essential.
Okay, unfortunately, I'd like to carry this conversation on for hours, but we can't. And I'm drawn to questions from the audience. So let me get to one for Katharine. Can you give us an update, Katharine, on the UK-EU Memorandum of Understanding? So this is all to do with the opportunities for UK-based financial services post-Brexit within the EU, and the blocks that maybe have been put in the UK's way. What's an update?
Well, I can't give you a great update, unfortunately, because we've done our bit of it, which is we agreed the memorandum through a really effective process with our Commission counterparts by the end of March, and we've signed it off at our end. It's now with the Commission in, I understand, inter-services consultation, and has been there for some time. We really hope that is expedited, because once that memorandum is agreed, we can get on with establishing our kind of routine ways of engaging, which I think is really important, not least actually to progress some of the issues we've just been talking about green and technology, which are really important for, you know, the region of Europe, not just for the jurisdictions of the UK and the European Union.
Is there concern, Katharine, about the business that has left London? I'm thinking about, the dollars and staff being allocated to EU offices rather than London. I'm thinking of share trading, some of that to Amsterdam. I'm thinking of derivatives, some of that to New York. Are you losing sleep over that? Are you trying to turn the tide on any of those trends?
Well, it's no secret that we didn't get the outcome we wanted with the European Union in that negotiation. We'd hoped to have comprehensive findings of mutual equivalence so that we could avoid this kind of quite costly market fragmentation, which ultimately hurts businesses and investors. That isn't where we ended up. We saw broadly a pretty smooth transition as we left the European Union. The operation of the share trading obligation drove change in equities, and there have been some changes in derivatives trading. We have not seen flood of either talent or capital out of the UK into the European Union. And the industry was indeed well prepared for the outcome that we've got. But what we need to do now is firstly do what we're doing, which is focusing on making the UK as competitive and attractive and safe a place to do business as possible. And secondly, get our relationship with the European Union onto a sort of reliable, transparent and understandable footing. So all our stakeholders understand how we're going to be working together and what we're working on, because it's that stability and certainty that I think is important for business.
Okay, and do you have any time horizon then on the memorandum of understanding now? Or is it
unfortunately
not really
you'd have to if you have a European Commission official participating today, I suggest you ask them again, okay, and then let me know the answer.
Okay, Jonathan, maybe you can put in a call later. Let me go to the second polling question just to close out our conversation then, and make sure we picked up on what the audience was thinking along these lines. The question that was asked: what are the biggest barriers to investments in the UK? So, assuming you see barriers, what are they? And the options were lack of available capital, regulations, long-term uncertainty, short-term uncertainty, government policy, or other. And I'm looking at the results. That's interesting. The highest share of the vote seems to have gone to short-term uncertainty, and I can guess you can understand why post Brexit and with COVID still being fought, that would loom large in our audience psyche right now. Lord Hill, just coming to close out with you then, do you think, when you were looking at listing rules, of course, which is only part of the story about money coming into the UK, but do any of those strike a chord as barriers to investment into the UK economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those questions and the answers, hit the right points. I think there are clearly a range. As you say, the listing aspect of things is a kind of subset of some of the broader issues about how you attract deeper pools of capital. And coming back to my first point, I think that was what I tried to set up with the listing review, with the annual report, some long-term recommendations that you try to encourage the government and the market to work at it over time and address some of these barriers.
Okay, mindful of the time, I'll draw things to a close there. Thank you all very much for joining us at the City UK annual conference. The conference, of course, does continue, but thank you very much for joining us on this panel. Thanks to Katharine Braddick, to Andy Briggs, to the Right Honourable, the Lord Hill of Oareford, and to Heath Tarbert. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.